We are going live, and I am thrilled that all of you are joining us. What a day, what a week filled with constitutional issues. So, who better to join us on the Frank Figliuzzi show today than a constitutional expert? If you have not, I'm seeing. So we've got this is the beauty of live broadcast. I'm seeing that Kim has told us that she's not hearing me. That's a problem. How about others? I hope I hope you're hearing me as well, but Kim is not. So while I introduce her, our producer says she can hear, and we're standing by so that he can hear. But let me take this time to introduce Kim to you, because if you aren't following Kim, then you need to. So here's Kim Wehle. She's an expert on constitutional law and the separation of powers. She's a professor of law at the University of Baltimore Law School. She's a legal contributor for ABC News, a former U.S. attorney in the District of Columbia. I wonder, she was a colleague there of my friend Glenn Kirshner, who also served as an assistant U.S. attorney in D.C. She's authored some great books. Look, if you want a layman's explanation of the law, if you're like, holy cow, there's so many constitutional issues being challenged right now, I need help, then you need to get Kim's book, several books, but including How to Read the Constitution and Why. And how about this? How about a book on pardon powers? Because boy, are we immersed in that. She was also, in case that wasn't enough, Kim Wehle was also a Fulbright scholar. Nobody likes a show off, but we do want one. We want an expert like this right now. So Kim, thanks for joining us on quite a day.
Great to be with you, my friend. Yes,
I'm thrilled. I'm thrilled. And I'd like to say that I planned all of this out very carefully because I knew the Supreme Court argument was today, but that would be not true. So we're just really fortunate. So before we get into the weeds, and we are going to try to cover three separate topics, and of course the topic of the day, birthright citizenship, and today's arguments in the Supreme Court, just give us your takeaway, having listened to the whole argument this morning.
Trump's going to lose. I think that's the bottom line.
Yeah.
It's problematic that we're even having a conversation as to whether the 14th Amendment actually counts as a law in the United States. Normally, if you don't like what the plain language of the Constitution says, you have to get a new amendment ratified. But Trump did manage to get on the merits before the United States Supreme Court the question of whether his executive order purporting to basically erase the plain language of the 14th Amendment regarding birthright citizenship, and based on the justices' questions, including the so-called conservatives, and with Donald Trump in the courtroom, the first time apparently in American history, they really gave Solicitor General John Sauer a hard time. And they honestly, Frank, had no choice because the arguments for the government are so weak.
Boy, so for people who've just been really down lately, this is an up day in the early assessments of how this went today and the future of our Constitution. When you hear people like Roberts and Gorsuch, and to some degree Thomas, really sounding skeptical, Trump's got a problem. Sean, let's put up the graphic of Trump's response, his post on Truth Social. If you want to know everything Trump feels about birthright citizenship, so here is it. Here's his post. We are the only country in the world stupid enough to allow birthright citizenship. President Donald J. Trump, all caps. And stupid, by the way, is in all caps. So, of course, I might come back and say we are the only country stupid enough to have voted for Donald Trump twice. But that's where he's coming from. And Kim, it seems to me, tell us if I'm wrong, that everything today seemed to hinge, for the most part, on 5 words, right? You're a U.S., all persons born or naturalized in the United States and comma, subject to the jurisdiction thereof. 5 words, subject to the jurisdiction thereof. That's what we heard about all day today. Tell us about that.
Well, I would go back to the beginning of what you just said. All persons born in the United States. You don't need an army of lawyers. You don't need history books into the 14th Amendment. You don't need a whole lot other than the ability to read and understand English. And Frank, this is one of the rare kinds of cases where the answer is in the text of the Constitution. Most of the time, what's an unreasonable search under the Fourth Amendment? You and I and 15 other people can have different views on what unreasonable means. That's when we need a court to resolve ambiguity. Here, it's not so much unclear. Now, why does it subject to the jurisdiction matter? From 1898 in a case called Wong Kim Ark, and I can talk about the facts of this case, but that case came down around the same time as ratification of the 14th Amendment, right after the Civil War. That case involved someone born in the United States whose parents were Chinese. And essentially the argument was, listen, the parents have loyalty to the Chinese government, not to the American government. Therefore, the 14th Amendment's birthright citizenship does not apply to him. And that was in a time when there was a lot of discrimination and racism against people of Chinese descent. Supreme Court said no, born means born. So within the jurisdiction, basically what the court meant, and this was clarified today in oral argument with one of the more progressive justices, is born in the jurisdiction meaning in the territory of the United States. So it's almost like a definition of what in the United States means. It means in the jurisdiction, within the authority, the territory of the United States. Now, what is Trump arguing? Trump is arguing this is about allegiance, exactly what the court rejected in 1898. And the justices were saying, well, and you know this from being in the criminal law world, when you're talking about allegiance, you're talking about intention, and that's super subjective. Yeah. And then he said, no, my definition of allegiance is domicile. What is domicile? Domicile is lawful residence plus an intent to remain, but we don't really want to talk about intent. We want to talk about lawful residence, and certain immigrants are not lawfully in the United States. So, you've got a very simple reading that is plain English, and then you've got to go through 3 or 4 wickets to get to their tortured reading, which is really about trying to ban immigrants in one form or another from getting citizenship. And that was, I think, the undercurrent that wasn't really it was touched on a few times. Frank, this is all about so-called illegal immigration.
So I think you said something really helpful here, because I'll include myself in this. I'm now deep in the rabbit hole of subject to the jurisdiction thereof, and my God, what did the founders mean by that? And you're suggesting, hey, keep it simple, stupid. It said if everybody born in the U.S. that's physically here. Right? It
says all, yeah. And within the jurisdiction, and I think it was Justice Kagan who said this. And I teach civil procedure, I teach constitutional law. This jurisdiction means authority. Does the FBI have jurisdiction over the crime scene, or do the local police have jurisdiction? That means who's in charge. And so that's essentially what that clause has always meant. Born in the United States, meaning you're not born on an embassy, for example.
Right. I was good. So let's go there. Let's go to the exceptions. Right. So next, if it's all persons born here, subject to the jurisdiction thereof, who's not? Who's born here and not subject? Isn't that everybody, or do we carve out exceptions?
Yeah. So there's exceptions. For example, children born of foreign diplomats.
Foreign diplomats.
And so, if you go to an embassy in Washington, technically you're on, it's theoretical really, but you're on within the Italian jurisdiction. Or we hear stories, and you see in Hollywood movies, run to the embassy, and then the bad guys can't get you.
I've had it in real life, not movies. I've had people run into the embassy. Yeah.
Yeah.
But so foreign diplomats who I worked with extensively when I was assigned to headquarters, probably saw the Brits and the Aussies every week. One of them has a baby here. That baby is carved out as not being a U.S. citizen because the parents are not under this. They have diplomatic immunity and therefore are not under the jurisdiction of the U.S. Yeah,
that's correct. And again, another exception that came up the only two really that came up, that and then the one with respect to Native Americans.
Oh, I love this. Oh my God. Do I have this right? Was this a trap that they laid for this question of the Solicitor General about, hey, so what about Native Americans? They have their own tribes and nations. And hey, Sean, can we play the clip of the Solicitor General responding to this? Is John? This is
Justice Gorsuch. I think
Gorsuch. Listen to this trap. Yeah.
He's very careful. He's very vigilant because he's from the western part of the country. He's very, very protective of Native American rights, of all the justices. It's one of his things. Yeah.
Sean,
Native Americans today are birthright citizens under your test and under your friend's test?
I think so. I mean, obviously, they've been granted citizenship by statute.
Put aside the statute. Do you think they're birthright citizens?
No, I think the clear understanding that everybody agrees in the congressional debates is that the children of tribal Indians are not birthright citizens.
I understand that's what they said, but your test is the domicile of the parents, and that would be the test you'd have us apply today, right?
Yes, yes. So if a tribal Indian, for example,
So, I mean, how do you think the Solicitor General handled that question for Gorsuch?
He hadn't thought it through. And, I must say, John Sauer, it runs circles or, around all kinds of questions. It's almost hard to follow him, but he does speak very quickly and he's clearly intelligent. This is one he hadn't thought through. And the reason he hadn't thought it through was because, like I told you, there's 3 or 4 steps to their new test. And one of those wickets you have to go through is domicile. And it's such a tortured test. He hadn't really thought through this idea of Native Americans or Indians. And, under the Constitution, people might not understand this, but under the Constitution, Indian tribes are considered sovereigns. They're not sovereigns in the same way as a foreign nation. That is, they're still subject to the jurisdiction of U.S. law.
Yeah, the FBI works crimes on reservations, right?
But they have their own tribal courts. They have their own governments, and they do get sovereign immunities and protections in ways that other walks of American life do not. And so, I think probably birthright citizenship, that they wouldn't necessarily get it under birthright citizenship as it's been interpreted since 1898, because they're subject to a separate sovereign. Congress has made it really clear for many years that they do get citizenship. Congress kind of went in and made it clear they get citizenship. But what he hadn't thought through was, wait a minute, I'm making up this cockamamie brand new domicile test. What do we do with this problem? And that's kind of stunning that he and the lawyers that prepped him hadn't thought that one through, particularly because Justice Gorsuch cares about that.
Yeah, unbelievable. And so this domicile thing, and also just wrapped up in this, as you helped us with, they're trying to say those 5 words, subject to the jurisdiction thereof, has to do with not only domicile but loyalty to the U.S. and we can't trust people who, and so it seemed to me that what Trump is trying to say is we'd have to literally do a background investigation on everybody who's giving birth here to see if they're loyal.
He was talking out of both sides of his mouth on that one, because the justices did ask that. I think it might have been Justice Barrett and Justice Jackson both said, wait, are we going to have mini trials now? I mean, are you going to have a baby's born and in the hospital you have to have some kind of factual inquiry, and do they get before a judge? And I think Justice Jackson said, are you going to take mom's deposition in the delivery room to see? And then he would dodge and pivot on these. He's like, no. Under the executive order, we have definitions, right? And so we just have to apply the executive order, which is certain kinds of immigrants. One of the other justices asked the question, if you're tracing this to parents, it says nothing in the 14th Amendment about parents. It says persons born. And then he's like,
it's the baby.
Newborns don't really have a domicile because they're brand new babies. So he said it's supposed to go to the parents. And then when the justice said, well, is it the mom or the dad? And he's like, well, President Trump says it's the mom in the executive order. And then all of a sudden, Frank, here we are with Donald Trump making up stuff for the Constitution. I think no one's going to say, listen, he gets to do it. Congress can't do it.
Yeah.
The Supreme Court doesn't get to do it.
Oh
The
my God.
the people through ratification, Donald Trump just gets to make up the new rule. I don't think this court's going to go for that, even though they're very sympathetic to Donald Trump. Yeah.
Everybody listening today, Kim is pointing out, at least I'm getting a lot out of this because it's clear now that this is even more convoluted than I thought it was. I was focused on those 5 words wrongly. And now we're talking about domicile. Is it the mom? Is it the dad? When the Constitution is clear, no, it's the baby, anybody born here. And it's the argument. I'm surprised they even took the case, to be quite honest with you.
I completely agree. I mean, Article 3 that gives the court the jurisdiction to actually resolve these kinds of cases talks about controversies. I mean, the idea is you have to have a thorny problem. You've got to have something to decide. There was really nothing to decide here. And the first bid that they had with one of these emergency petitions that Trump challenged, because of course courts across the country are applying the 14th Amendment, the plain language, they took it as an opportunity to ban so-called universal injunctions, which we can talk about, which was a gift to Donald Trump. They basically did his bidding in this emergency thing. But the fact that they didn't use that to just slap this one down. I mean, the problem, Frank, is that, it's left millions of Americans in the midst of a crackdown by ICE in fear that their kids could be non-citizens. And one more thing, one of the justices asks, I think it was Jackson, could you strip people of their citizenship retroactively?
Which, by the way, I think Trump would love to do.
Well, he went back to the executive order and says, well, we're not doing that now. And this justice responded and said, yeah, but what, you could change your mind later.
No.
The Constitution's the Constitution. As you know, Frank, it's not unconstitutional one day and, or constitutional or unconstitutional the next day. I mean, if they declare that this was always misread, it should have been domicile, whatever, allegiance / whatever, then it throws into the complete confusion of many, many, many years of birthright citizenship.
Well, and if people are wondering, you heard Kim's reference to this could affect millions. If people are wondering what the numbers look like, and Kim, tell me if you have different numbers. But what I found was approximately 300,000 babies a year are born here to either non-U.S. citizens or non-lawful or status people. Is that about right? 300,000?
Yeah, that's about right. Yeah,
you can imagine the mess that this is going to create. And kind of to almost close this out, Sean, play John Roberts, the Chief Justice. He puts Sauer, the Solicitor General, in his place. Sauer's trying to say the Constitution needs to be reinterpreted because, we're living in a new world. Sean, play that for us.
Your interpretation has made a mess of the provision.
Well, it certainly wasn't a problem in the 19th century.
No, but of course, we're in a new world now, as Justice Alito pointed out, where 8 billion people are one plane ride away from having a child who's a U.S. citizen.
Well, it's a new world. It's the same Constitution.
It's a new world, but it's the same Constitution. John Roberts. I love that.
They were not going to take the political bait. They weren't going for it. And that was really reassuring.
That should be a bumper sticker or a T-shirt. It's a new world, but the same Constitution. That's for you. You can put that on. We've given it to you free of charge.
I wrote that one down too, Frank. I must say it really was stunning coming out of the Chief Justice. And again, it comes back to the top of the show. This is not about what's the proper reading of the Constitution. This is about shoving his immigration policy down the throats of Americans. And you can do that through the United States Congress. You can do that through an amendment to the Constitution. The justices are saying you're not doing it through us.
So I'll close out with this. A lot on this topic, and we'll move on. But a lot of folks listening to us, watching us today, may have dual citizenship. I can't tell you, and I'm sure you're experiencing this too, in your network of people saying, I need a plan B. I need to have some, if all hell breaks loose here and we lose our democracy, I need to go somewhere else. And they've applied for and even obtained citizenship somewhere else. Is there any possibility that the 14th Amendment and this, subject to the jurisdiction thereof, is exclusive, subject to the exclusive jurisdiction thereof? Could we be going to a place where if you have dual citizenship and you're American, you're kicked out, or you have to give up one of them?
Well, the two elements, and I'm not sure how they reconcile, is allegiance, right? Their new definition is allegiance. And then the other part of the new definition is domicile, meaning I'm living here and I intend to stay here. So under both of those, I think new tests that Donald Trump through John Sauer wants to replace with, like the leading test, which is you're just born within the authority of the United States territory. Sky's the limit. I don't put anything past this president, and unfortunately, these lawyers. My latest Substack, I talk about how so many executive orders and things, and even representations in court, are getting past the lawyers that never would have gotten past the lawyers before. I mean, there's a White House counsel for a reason, right? There's a Department of Justice Attorney General for a reason. Lawyers are supposed to tell presidents, listen, this is okay, this is not okay. We saw this with January 6th, the infamous memo telling Vice President Pence that he could actually not certify the election. That's at least under a world where you had to pretend you could get through the lawyers. I mean, now the stuff that's coming out under the auspices of the White House with a seal that's supposed to go through lawyers, it's not being lawyered, Frank. And I think it's really confusing to people. This
is scary stuff. And I'm sure many of you out there who have the dual citizenship, who've gotten it in the last year or two because of your concerns, are now flipping out. And I don't mean to panic people, but my God, if you go, let's say you did Canada, Ireland, Italy, whatever you're eligible to get, and now you visit over there and you come back and you've come back with your Canada passport or your Italian passport, and now they stop you at the airport and they go, "What's the deal with this? You're a U.S. citizen carrying the Italian passport." And now here you go. You're in secondary, and who knows?
I mean, Justice Barrett asked a similar question. She said, "What if you're an American citizen, but you're living in Norway, and you married a Norwegian?" I mean, I don't know if she added that detail, but you're living in Norway. You come to the United States. You have a baby in the United States. You're an American citizen, and you move back to Norway, because you are not, don't have an intent to remain here, and maybe your allegiance is in more than one place. Does that mean your child's not an American citizen? I mean, it's a hot mess beyond, it's a hot mess of hot messes. One last point, though, that I think is important is that it could create like stateless people that don't have any state. So, for example, Nepal, if you are a Nepalese citizen and you have a baby in the United States, there's no way under Nepalese law for your baby to be a citizen of Nepal. So you'd have stateless people because they were born in the United States. And that, Justice Alito mentioned, is a violation of humanitarian international law. So it's layers and layers and layers, Frank. It's really just a nightmare.
Yeah. So this is a huge test of the Constitution and the court, and we're going to hope that common sense and the Constitution prevails. Let's move on to, even if we'd had so much to talk about, even if this hearing didn't happen today. Yesterday, our fine president signed an executive order that impacts mail-in voting. And specifically, if I understand it correctly, he wants the Department of Homeland Security, in concert with the Social Security Administration, to create a national list of eligible voters. And then he wants the U.S. Postal Service to not send absentee ballots to people who are not on the Trump-approved list of voters. Do I have that right?
That's what my understanding is. I mean, to me, it sounds like a complete panic move. I mean, the president doesn't have any power over voting laws. Zero. The president has none.
The Constitution tells us how this. The Constitution tells us how this works, right?
And there's also not. You would probably know this better, Frank. I don't think there's like a list anywhere of eligible voters in the. The states have their own, roles, and I know that Trump administration is trying to get the various states to turn over their voter lists, their privacy laws in place, their state laws in place. But the bottom line is the Constitution clearly gives each state its own authority to decide who gets to vote and when. There is actually no affirmative right to vote in the Constitution. You have a right to free speech. You have a right to assembly. You have a right to bear arms and different interpretations of that. But there is no part of the Constitution that says you have a right to vote. Frankly, how your eligibility for the ballot is based on what state law says, with limitations under, say, the 14th Amendment, if it's just, discriminatory voting. And there are some amendments to the Constitution that make it unconstitutional to ban women, for example, completely. But it's up to the states. Now, the federal government does have some authority, because all of us can go to the DMV and register. The Constitution says Congress can make voting laws for federal elections. When the Congress does that, the states have said, listen, it's a pain to have two separate ballots and two separate systems. So if Congress makes a law, we'll just go along with it, and we'll let everybody register to vote, because you have to allow it for members of Congress, those kinds of elections anyway. So we'll just allow it for everybody. But nowhere can the president step in like a king or a dictator and override everything. It's just silliness. But the problem in part, Frank, is I think there's confusion. You and I have to sit here now and take up time explaining that that is blatantly unconstitutional and there's no authority for that. This is, again, where are the lawyers? The lawyers are supposed to be the gatekeepers, so that you and I and federal judges aren't having to waste our breath saying, no, 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 the sky isn't purple polka dots. And
of course, where are the GOP lawmakers standing up and saying, that, hey, time out, that's enough of that. You're not creating a Trump list of eligible voters. And it's funny, you reminded me, the executive order says eligible voters, not registered voters. So he's already asked the states, and Texas has already given up their list of registered voters. Now he's going a step further. Eligible voters means everybody who's a citizen and 18 years old and up.
Yeah, I don't think that list exists. The last time we did a census, it was during COVID, and he took steps to make it really hard to count people who don't necessarily have a residence. And that's, of course, every 10 years. And that's never a perfectly accurate count.
Do we want political appointees at DHS, Mark Wayne Mullen, oh my, and the whoever's the Trump's head of Social Security, and how about the Postmaster General, which might someday be Trump's? It certainly was for a god-awful amount of time. So you want them deciding whether Frank or Kim can vote and whether they're on or off the list? My word.
Yeah, this Postal Service thing is a problem. I mean, this is a bit of a tangent, but that was the fact that there are post offices all over the country is how his administration justified overriding, state governors and bringing in the National Guard. The idea that there's federal property that needs to be protected. There's it's kind of looking for whatever stretch of the imagination will give him unlimited power. And what people need to understand, I'm dating myself. I watched Schoolhouse Rock when I was growing up. But my 4 kids know every word to Hamilton, the musical, right? So we all know, generation after generation, no more kings. We are not a monarchy. I mean, we had no King's Day last weekend, but he's giving us an opportunity to reaffirm these very basic principles. You don't need to be a lawyer or a career FBI senior official to know we are, with the stroke of a pen, he can't do whatever he wants. That's not American democracy. Yeah.
And I actually, so you're, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but you're confident that this will be challenged legally. It already, this executive order, and that it will win, but it'll be dragged through the courts and go all the way up, you think?
It'll definitely be struck down. Again, it'll depend on what kind of Cirque du Soleil gymnastics his lawyers can come up with to concoct some kind of justification. They managed to get all the way to the Supreme Court on birthright citizenship.
We did.
So, in the old days, 10 years ago, and I was in the Justice Department, government lawyers don't make up arguments because the judges held them almost to higher standards. There's also ethical rules. The federal courts have rules that require legitimate fact-based and legal arguments, or you could be sanctioned. I don't know what happened to that. The lawyers seem to think if we throw it on the wall, it'll stick. Let's just do it, even if there's no legal basis. So there will be challenges. There's no way, Frank. And then the question to your point, even if it's upheld, how is he going to actually enforce it? Because there is no such list.
Right. Well, Oh boy, yeah, he'll order those agencies to come up with something. But my Lord, it's continued. Each one of these is just a continued effort to suppress the vote.
And make people afraid and make people think
Right.
he has more power than he has.
That's right.
Make people feel that it's not even worth voting, or I don't want to vote. It's going to be stressful or scary, or if you are an immigrant.
Well, yeah,
I don't
Todd
wanna be
Blanche.
picked up.
Look at Todd Blanche, as the Deputy Attorney General at CPAC last week, actually said he doesn't understand why people would object to having ICE agents at the polls. Well, because brown people won't show up. How about that? How about that? Yeah. All right, let's go on.
And I brought all my kids hand in, I wanted them to experience what it means when they were little they went and voted with me. I don't want people with guns. There's psychological impacts to this. I mean, Tom Blanche, I'm not sure what happened to his integrity as a lawyer. I really don't understand.
This is a guy who says he still considers himself to be the personal attorney of the president while he's masquerading as Deputy Attorney General. It's astounding. I want to cover.
He also has ethical obligations to the bar and to the rule of law as lawyers, and
I think
it's getting harder and harder, Frank, to explain that to my students. I have to come in and say, listen, you don't get to just ignore the law. You don't. I didn't used to have to say that pre-Trump.
I know it was a given, and so many lawyers are going to lose their bar licenses, I think, after this. But I hope. I hope. Let's cover something that we, independent of each other, we both wrote about recently. We both did columns about Antifa, the so-called Antifa in quotes, and terrorism. And we had quite the outcome in a federal courtroom in Fort Worth, Texas, several days ago, where 8 people were convicted of material support to terrorism. And what, pray tell, was the terrorist organization they were members of? According to DOJ, Antifa. Tell us about where we are on President Trump's declaration of Antifa as a domestic terrorism organization, the use of a material support to terrorism statute, and where does this go?
So I think the memorandum is NPSM 7. It's basically one of Donald Trump's executive orders / memoranda. It's basically, the same thing. Several months ago, 2025, declaring all kinds of people potentially terrorist organizations if they're anti-American or anti-Christian. This is, Frank, a frightening assault at the heart of the First Amendment. And what I explain to people around the First Amendment is that, you think before you speak, right? If you have to worry about your speech putting you in prison, you will sort of censor your thinking. That's really what we're talking about when we're talking about fascism or authoritarianism, where you don't have the liberty to think freely because you're worried that you could, if you speak in a way that the administration doesn't like, the government doesn't like, you could lose your liberty. So this indictment originally was about some violent activity outside of an ICE facility.
Yeah, it was an ugly, let's get, as I say in my column, this is not a pretty scenario. And so, let's call it out. A police officer was shot at this protest. That's a given. The guy who did that shooting is facing life in prison. So good on that. We're all against shooting officers. We want to deter
that. We want to deter that kind of behavior.
Yeah,
and that's why we have the criminal laws in place.
Right. Guess what? There's a law. There's a law against shooting police officers. So
and it's working. And the first indictment, that's all it covered was the violent behavior. Then, from a timing standpoint, after the assassination of Charlie Kirk, they amended the indictment. They got a superseding indictment that added this terrorism charge. And as you said, what's frightening in part is that it stuck. The jury actually convicted them, and saying, not only were they engaged in this violent activity, but they were somehow behind the scenes part of an imaginary group called Antifa, which I think just means anti-fascist. And I'm anti-fascist. I'll be honest. I'm not for fascism in the United States. I mean, you and I think a lot of Americans probably would call themselves anti-fascist.
How about all the World War II veterans? How about those folks? Yeah.
Golly gee, here we are saying I'm against fascism. I mean, we are talking about having this conversation, you and I, that being a crime potentially. Yeah,
wow. Because the prosecution in this case, if folks are wondering, used evidence like, they used Signal group chat. They must be organized. They talked about how prior protests were not working and they'd have to step it up. So to give you my background, I supervised a joint terrorism task force in my career. On the international side of terrorism, the United States government has quite the lengthy process to designate an international terrorism group and therefore use the statute called material support to terrorism, which is historically for international terror groups. So if you're thinking Al Qaeda, Boko Haram, ISIS, that goes through multi-agencies, State Department, Treasury, Justice, on, before we can say as a government, you, Al Qaeda, are a designated terror group, and then use all the tools of the US government. What President Trump is doing in basically an order to the Attorney General is saying, never mind all that process we use for foreigners. I'm saying the people who oppose to me, I call them Antifa, are now a domestic terror group. Do I have that right?
Yeah, and I think the distinction between the international and the domestic is really crucial to what we're talking about, right? So they designate an international terrorist group. And if you are you're in the United States and you're supporting that international terrorist group, you can get in trouble with the criminal laws. But this is taking Americans and saying your collaboration around an idea, which as far as we know, that's all Antifa is an idea. And there are some objectionable ideas to many people that are protected under the First Amendment, not only as a matter of speech, but as assembly. Taking an idea or set of ideas. This memo talks about being anti-American. Who gets to decide that? If you share an idea, that can become something that puts you in jail, right? What's the difference between a civil action for money damages and a criminal action? I start my first year law students on this. Most people don't understand this. The criminal action can take away your liberty. It can take away your life. It's the most powerful thing the government can do. So what we saw in Texas is the step from across the bridge from ideas becoming criminal in the United States. Association with people becoming a crime based on ideas and ideas that are undefined.
Exercising constitutional rights now becoming criminal. And in terms of not defined, so people need to understand something. The Attorney General of the United States, Pam Bondi, took Trump's order on Antifa and calling them a domestic terror organization. And she, as Kim alluded to, she came up with, Antifa is like, being anti-capitalism or anti-Christian. What? Wow. And then I want people to understand from the FBI, the law enforcement side of things, once the FBI has a designation of a terror organization, right? And by the way, I don't think it's a legitimate designation because we now, as I said, we afford more due process to get Al Qaeda and figuring out whether they or Hezbollah or Hamas, whether they are legit terror organizations. But once you have that designation, the FBI has all the tools in its toolkit to come at you. I mean, undercover work, sources, informants, court-ordered wiretaps, all bets are off.
And also, Frank, isn't that designation require, some kind of evidence of membership? And then also, doesn't it require some evidence that they're about, violent intimidation, coercion, like they're really engaged in some scary stuff, not just have points of view that
Right.
this particular president doesn't like.
For sure. So in the Fort Worth case, tell me if I've got this wrong, there was never any discussion put into evidence that, for example, these protesters said, we're absolutely going to shoot a cop today. That's not there. In fact, you want to argue for domestic terror organization. In the international side, you do have these steps of, okay, this guy has sworn an oath to Al Qaeda. You see that happen. This guy's pledged bayat. He's going. And how about domestically? How about Mike Flynn, who swore an oath to QAnon? How about that? Is QAnon a domestic terror? I mean, this is why, folks, you've heard me say, I don't believe in designating a domestic terror organizations because of the abuse we're now seeing in real life. Someone's going to abuse it. It's attractive. Yeah, by God, we don't have a law. We don't even, right? I'm for, I used to be, I'm for exploring whether we should have a domestic terror law, but I've always been against designating groups because of this abuse. Kim, where do you come down on domestic terror? You think existing laws can cover it?
No, I think it's something that Congress, if we want to go in that direction, like lots of things, Frank, Congress should be the ones to debate it and put a bill on the floor and have the press cover it and talk about all the problems with it and get it through both houses and signed by a president. I mean, you mentioned the Republicans in Congress, and people are feeling so helpless right now. A lot of people, what can we do? What can we do? What can we do? What can we do? And I, as I mentioned, I teach constitutional law. All roads lead back to Congress. Yeah. There's so many problems that we're having right now that all we need is a functioning Congress. I mean, that's easier said than done because we've got problems with our campaign finance laws, thanks in part to the Supreme Court that incentivizes our elected officials to care about billionaires and dark money and not about actual citizens' needs. But our Constitution is set up that, maybe there are arguments for domestic terrorism law. Put that through the Congress, then what would happen, Frank? There'd be a lawsuit filed challenging that law, saying it violates the First Amendment. Then we would have a neutral judge who's there, appointed, not elected, there for life, decide, wait a minute, is the harm with domestic terrorism, are there infringements on the freedom of association, freedom of speech, freedom of thinking that are imposed by fear that, wait, I don't know, am I going to be part of a terrorist group now because I'm talking about stuff against this government? The judge would then decide if the need to protect Americans from domestic terrorists outweighs the infringements on speech. That is how it is supposed to work, not an executive order, a rogue Department of Justice, a rogue Attorney General whose loyalty is to a man, not to the Constitution, not to the rule of law, coming up with a novel theory that makes it through a jury. And I assume that the conviction will be appealed. But this is going way too far, too fast, Frank. All this stuff is way too far, too fast.
This is why our judges and courts need to hold strong, because when that, again, I keep coming at it from my own life experience, when that FBI agent swears out an affidavit in front of a U.S. judge or magistrate and says, I want to go up on a warrant, or I want to go up on a wiretap, or I want to do this, use this tool. The judge has to say, hold on a second. Where is the violence here? What are they doing other than protesting? That's where the line has to be drawn.
And I'll tell you, the judges are holding. I mean, we saw striking down, the dismantling or defunding of NPR. We saw one this week stopping this ballroom. I mean,
the ballroom.
And at the same time, these judges are under personal threats, their families. It's skyrocketed. It's coming, the Supreme Court justices, after the tariff ruling, Donald Trump himself came out attacking them. So you know what listeners can do? Support the federal judiciary. Support the federal judiciary. These people are patriots, and they're doing the hard thing that the members of Congress will not do, and that people in the administration, the lawyers, will not do. They're telling him no. They're
Yeah,
telling
I
him
think-
no, and he
And I
doesn't
think
like
they're
it.
going to be, it's just beginning. I think that they're going to be tested and challenged like never before in the upcoming year or two. Hey, I want to thank you. You may have missed some of it because of the technical glitch. You may have missed some of my interview. I covered your books and your background. Tell people that what I did not cover, Kim, was where people can find you. I mean, where people are watching us right now on Substack and YouTube. Tell us where you are.
Yeah, so at Kim Wehle is my handle everywhere, Wehle. It's a German name. And I do a Substack called The Little Law School. You can find it with my name, where I break down the basic legal questions these are my books too, without sacrificing the more nuanced elements of it. I try to translate complex legal issues into everyday language so people can answer these questions, or at least start to, on their own, because knowledge and education is power in this moment too, Frank. So
Thanks for doing what you do. And if you love this discussion, please check out Kim's book, How to Read the Constitution and Why. And then as Kim feels free to depart, we're certainly at over the 45-minute mark. I want to leave, and you, Kim, you could go. I know you've got all kinds of news requests today, but thank you. Or you can stay for this final amusement. Up to you.
I'm intrigued.
I'm gonna tell us a real brief story about. I was a third-year law student, so that's the last year of law school. At least it was for me. And I get this really cool internship at the Organized Crime Strike Force in New Haven, Connecticut, and I find myself allowed to argue a motion in federal court in New Haven against a mob family. So, not to bore you to death, but in Connecticut, La Cosa Nostra was controlled out of the Patriarca family out of Rhode Island. So the case is on the Connecticut faction of that. And I get to argue a motion to detain one of the mobsters during appeal. And the prosecutors had told me, just so you know, they're going to follow you home. They're intimidating all of us. Today's appearance by Donald Trump in the Supreme Court, the first time a president has ever showed up for an argument in the Supreme Court, reminded me that when I went to argue this motion as a law student, I turn around from the podium and I see the entire front row of the court filled with La Cosa Nostra henchmen who, with their arms crossed, who indeed followed me home. That's what I thought of today. And Sean, it reminded me also of The Sopranos. And if you're a fan of The Sopranos, there's a clip we're going to play of Uncle June, talking to Bobby about a criminal trial he's in the middle of and how he needs some help in the courtroom, if you know what I mean. Sean?
You know, Bobby, a little support in the courtroom would be nice. Or are you still hanging crepe?
I took care of the thing last night.
The guy, you saw him?
Him and 184 won't be a problem.
Good. Give me that weight over there. The one in the middle.
Yeah, so Uncle June, today we saw Uncle Junior in court. He needed some help.
I was asked about that on NPR, and it's hard to climb in Donald Trump's mind, but given how he went after the justices after the tariff ruling, it's hard not to make that connection. But I'll tell you, Frank, I don't know if you got a chance to listen to it. They were not intimidated. You couldn't tell at all. They asked hard questions, and I really do think that he's going to lose this one, which he should.
I agree, and I am, as you've mentioned, I am concerned about security, and I know the U.S. Marshals have their work cut out for them if Trump goes after them again. Thank you, everybody. Stay safe out there. Kim, we'll see you on Substack and on TV.
Little Law School. Great to be with you. Thanks, Frank.
Take care. Thank you. Bye.